The night Olivia Walker became CEO, the city of Boston glowed like it was complicit. From the 32nd floor of the glass tower overlooking the Charles River, the lights looked deliberate, each window a witness, each reflection polished enough to hide what it didn't want seen. The celebration inside was immaculate. Champagne chilled to the exact degree, string lights strung with casual elegance, and a jazz quartet that played softly enough not to interrupt ambition. Ethan stood near the window, untouched drink in hand, watching his wife become someone else. Olivia moved through the room with the confidence of a woman who had rehearsed this moment for years. Her black dress was understated expensive in a way that refused to announce itself. She smiled often, but never lingered. Every gesture was efficient, every laugh calculated. When the board chairman tapped his glass and announced her appointment as CEO of Helix Biomedical, the applause was immediate and thunderous. Ethan clapped too, out of instinct, out of habit, out of love that hadn't yet accepted it was already obsolete. Couldn't have done it without my team, Olivia said into the microphone, her voice steady. This company is my life. She did not look at Ethan. The omission was small, nearly invisible. No one else noticed. They wouldn't have known what to look for. But Ethan felt it land in his chest with a weight disproportionate to its size, like a hairline crack spreading through glass. Later, someone from marketing leaned toward him and said, "You must be so proud." Ethan smiled. "I am." He meant it, which somehow made it worse. They drove home separately. Olivia had meetings in New York the next morning, she said. Ethan didn't argue. He hadn't argued in years, not in ways that mattered. Their house sat on a quiet street in Brookline, all white siding and symmetry. It had been Olivia's dream. Ethan had designed it himself, every line intentional, every window placed to maximize light. Standing alone in the kitchen, he realized the house felt less like a home and more like a successful prototype. His phone buzzed at 11:47 p.m. "From Olivia, I filed the paperwork tonight. My lawyer will contact yours tomorrow." No preamble, no explanation, no apology. Ethan sat down at the kitchen table, the message glowing between his hands. The sound of the refrigerator humming filled the silence. Somewhere in the house, a pipe clicked as it cooled. Filed. Not "we need to talk." Not "I'm unhappy." Just a procedural verb, clean and bloodless. He thought of the years he'd adjusted his career to accommodate hers. The job offers he'd declined. The competitions he'd quietly withdrawn from because Olivia needed stability, space, silence. He thought of the night she came home late and he pretended not to notice the perfume that wasn't hers. Still, that wasn't the thought that hurt most. What hurt was the realization that Olivia believed she was leaving with everything. Ethan stood and walked to his study, a room Olivia never used. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a thin folder of old emails printed long ago when something in him had insisted on keeping them. At the time, he hadn't known why. He knew now. Outside, Boston continued to shine. Inside, Ethan Walker finally understood the shape of the war he had never agreed to fight. And the thing Olivia did not know, could never imagine, was that the man she had just discarded was the only one still standing between her and the collapse of everything she had built. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who smiled too much. Ethan signed without comment, the pen heavier than it should have been, his name stretching across the page with a familiarity that felt undeserved. The courier thanked him as if this were a successful transaction and disappeared down the front steps of the Brookline house. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing Ethan inside a silence that felt rehearsed, precise, intentional, inevitable. The documents were immaculate. Every page was labeled, indexed, cross-referenced, assets categorized, timelines clarified, language stripped of emotion, padded with legal neutrality. There were no accusations, no explanations, just a clean severing of a life that had taken 14 years to assemble. Olivia's handwriting appeared only once on the final page. Her signature was confident, almost elegant. Ethan studied it longer than he should have, noticing how it leaned forward, now aggressive in a way it hadn't been before. Even her name had evolved without him. He placed the papers neatly back into the envelope and set them on the kitchen counter, aligning the edges until they were perfectly square. The habit surprised him. Order had always been his role in the marriage, the quiet stabilizer, the man who absorbed chaos so she could ascend. He leaned against the counter and closed his eyes. Moments rose uninvited, not the dramatic ones, Not the fights or the long silences afterward, but the smaller sacrifices, the ones no one ever counted. He remembered turning down a senior partnership offer in Chicago because Olivia had just been promoted and couldn't afford the distraction. He remembered flying an economy while she upgraded, telling himself it didn't matter. Remembered waiting in hospital corridors alone when his father died because Olivia had a board meeting she couldn't reschedule. At the time, none of it had felt like loss. It had felt like investment. Ethan moved through the house slowly as if walking through a museum curated by a version of himself that no longer existed. The living room still smelled faintly of Olivia's perfume, something expensive and sharp, like ambition distilled. On the mantel sat framed photographs, vacations, award ceremonies, carefully chosen happiness. He took one down. The photo was from 5 years earlier, taken at a charity gala in New York. Olivia stood radiant in a silver dress, hand resting lightly on his arm. Ethan remembered that night vividly, not because of the glamour, but because it was the first time he'd felt her pull away while standing right beside him. Her attention had been elsewhere, eyes scanning the room, already reaching for a future he couldn't quite see. He placed the frame face down. By noon, his phone began to buzz. Texts from mutual friends, confused, sympathetic, restrained. Emails from colleagues who had already heard something phrased carefully enough to deny curiosity. One message from his sister asking if he wanted company. He ignored them all. At 2 o'clock, his lawyer called. "She's requesting a fast-track dissolution," the man said, voice professional, almost bored. "No contest, no mediation. She wants this done quietly." Quietly. Ethan looked out the window at the street, where a young couple pushed a stroller past the house laughing about something trivial. He wondered how long it would take before they learned the vocabulary of endings. "Is there a problem?" the lawyer asked. "No," Ethan replied. "There isn't." And that was the truth. The problem had already happened. That evening, Ethan opened the folder in his study again, not the divorce papers, but the older one. The emails were dated nearly a decade back, exchanged during a period when Helix Biomedical had been struggling to secure funding. Olivia had been a senior executive then, brilliant but desperate to prove herself indispensable. Ethan read slowly, carefully, as if the words might change if approached differently. They didn't. The language was cautious but clear. Decisions made in private, data selectively omitted. A clinical trial accelerated before all concerns were resolved. Nothing explicitly illegal, nothing that would trigger alarms at first glance. But enough. Enough to raise questions. Enough to unravel trust if pulled into the light. At the time, Ethan had confronted Olivia gently. She had cried. She had said it was temporary, necessary, that the system was broken and she was just learning how to survive inside it. She had told him he was the only person she trusted enough to tell. And he had believed her. He had locked the emails away, not as leverage, but as insurance against a future he didn't yet understand. Now sitting alone in the dim study, Ethan felt the weight of that choice settle differently. This secret, their secret, had lived quietly between them for years, shaping their power without either of them naming it. Olivia believed she had outgrown him, believed she had moved beyond the marriage, beyond the man who once mattered. What she did not know was that her ascent had always rested in part on Ethan's silence. That night, Olivia didn't come home. Ethan slept alone in the master bedroom for the last time, staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of a house that no longer belonged to about a we. He felt anger, yes, but beneath it something colder and more dangerous. Clarity. The divorce had been filed with surgical precision, but surgeries he knew often left scars no one expected. And the most dangerous ones were the scars no one could see. Ethan learned about the other man by accident. It wasn't a confession or a careless text left open on a shared device. Olivia was too disciplined for that. It surfaced instead through a LinkedIn notification, an algorithmic nudge that suggested people you may know. One name appeared again and again beside hers. Marcus Hale, Chief Strategy Officer, Helix Biomedical. Recently divorced. Recently relocated to New York. Recently promoted. Ethan stared at the profile longer than necessary. Marcus had the kind of face companies trusted, mid-40s, carefully unremarkable confidence without warmth. His resume was impressive in a way that suggested survival more than brilliance. Ethan clicked through photos, panels, conferences, fundraisers. In several of them, Olivia stood nearby. Not touching, not distant either. always angled toward him, close enough to choose. The realization didn't hurt the way Ethan had expected. There was no sharp spike of jealousy, no cinematic collapse. Instead, a dull confirmation settled in his chest like a diagnosis he'd already suspected, but hadn't bothered to name. So this was the story everyone would understand. The ambitious woman, the emotional affair, the marriage that couldn't survive success. It was neat, marketable, forgivable. Later that afternoon, Ethan drove into the city navigating Boston traffic with muscle memory alone. He parked near the harbor and walked without direction, letting the cold air cut through the static in his head. Couples passed him, coworkers spilled out of cafes, conversations layered over one another, like noise in a crowded terminal. He thought of Marcus and felt nothing. What unsettled him wasn't the possibility that Olivia had loved someone else. It was how little that revelation explained. Back in his study that evening, Ethan reopened the folder, not the printed emails this time, but an old external hard drive he hadn't powered on in years. He plugged it into his laptop, waited as the files populated slowly like ghosts returning on their own terms. He searched by date, by project, by the internal code name he remembered too well, Atlas Phase 2. The documents were dense presentations, internal memos, red-lined reports. Ethan moved through them with the patience of an architect reviewing stress points. Patterns emerged. Revisions timed suspiciously close to investor meetings. Risk assessments softened, then buried. Language adjusted not to clarify but to obscure. And then he saw Marcus Hale's name. Not prominently, never as the final authority, but threaded throughout suggestions, here reframes there always just enough to redirect outcomes without owning them. Marcus hadn't initiated the questionable decisions. He had optimized them. Ethan leaned back, fingers steepled, pulse steady. This wasn't about an affair. This was about alignment. Olivia hadn't just drifted toward Marcus emotionally. She had chosen him strategically, someone who mirrored her moral flexibility, who spoke the language of growth without restraint, who understood which lines mattered only if someone was watching. Ethan remembered a night 3 years earlier when Olivia had come home late, eyes bright with adrenaline. "We're finally moving forward," she'd said, dropping her bag by the door. "Marcus gets it. He doesn't slow things down with hypotheticals." Ethan had smiled, then asked her if she was tired, asked if she'd eaten. He hadn't asked what they were moving past. The deeper Ethan dug, the clearer it became the real betrayal wasn't that Olivia had given her attention to another man. It was that she had systematically erased the version of herself that once believed restraint was strength. And she had done it while knowing Ethan was watching. Worse, while trusting he would stay silent. His phone buzzed, a text from Olivia, the first since the filing. "We should talk logistics soon. I want this to be respectful." Respectful? Ethan almost laughed. He typed nothing back. Instead, he opened a video file attached to an old calendar entry. The footage was grainy, shot during a Helix internal review meeting years ago. Olivia sat at the table, younger, less polished. She raised concerns about Atlas Phase 2, her voice firm but cautious. "We don't have enough longitudinal data yet," she said in the video. "Rushing this could expose patients to risk we can't justify." Marcus, off camera, responded calmly. "Every delay has a cost too, Olivia. Patients are already exposed to doing nothing." The room had nodded. Ethan paused the video. That was the woman he had married, not the CEO who filed for divorce hours after securing power. Not the executive who framed ethics as obstacles, but the professional who once believed accountability mattered even when no one demanded it. The affair was only the symptom. The betrayal was philosophical. Late that night, Ethan received an email forwarded from a former Helix analyst he barely remembered. No message. Just an attachment and a subject line that read, "Thought you should have this." The attachment was an internal audit draft, never finalized, never submitted. It outlined discrepancies in Atlas Phase 2 that, if disclosed, would raise immediate regulatory scrutiny. At the bottom of the draft, one sentence stood out, highlighted and commented on, but unresolved. "Decision to proceed appears influenced by executive pressure rather than clinical consensus." Executive pressure. Ethan closed his laptop slowly. Olivia believed her divorce had freed her, believed the emotional affair was the line she'd crossed and survived. She did not yet understand that the real story had nothing to do with love. It was about choices, about who she had become, and about the man she assumed would always clean up the silence behind her. Ethan stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the city again. Boston no longer glowed. It simply existed, indifferent, unromantic, honest. For the first time since the filing, Ethan felt something like resolve take shape. The other man wasn't the real betrayal, but the truth buried beneath him that could destroy everything. The secret did not announce itself all at once. It emerged slowly, the way rot reveals itself in a structure that still looks sound from the outside, through patterns, omissions, the unnatural neatness of certain decisions. Ethan had learned over years of designing buildings that what mattered most was never what was visible, but what had been deliberately hidden. He took a week off work, not because he needed rest, but because time had become the only resource that mattered. Each morning he sat in his study with a mug of coffee that went cold untouched, moving between email threads, audit drafts, calendar invites, and archived Slack conversations salvaged from old backups. Olivia had always underestimated his patience. She mistook his quiet for passivity. That had been her most consistent error. The emails told a story no single document dared to tell outright. A delayed adverse event report rerouted to legal instead of compliance. A revised patient exclusion criterion added after enrollment had begun. A statistical adjustment that softened outcome variance just enough to cross an investor threshold. None of it illegal in isolation. Together, it formed something far more dangerous intent. And Olivia's name was everywhere, not as the author, rarely as the explicit decision-maker. She had learned, perhaps, from Markeshaw to lead without leaving fingerprints. Her instructions appeared as suggestions, her pressure framed as concern, her authority disguised as consensus. Ethan paused at one email dated 7 years earlier, from Olivia Walker. Let's proceed with the revised model. If we wait for perfect data, we'll lose momentum and control of the narrative. Control of the narrative. Ethan leaned back, the chair creaking beneath him. He remembered that week clearly. Olivia had come home exhausted, irritable, snapping at trivial things. When he'd asked what was wrong, she'd said only, "I'm tired of being the one who slows things down." He hadn't argued. He had poured her a glass of wine and told her she was doing great. By Thursday, the truth took a more concrete shape. Ethan found the document buried in a folder labeled Board Prep, Confidential. It was a preliminary internal memo written by a junior compliance officer who no longer worked at Helix. The memo flagged a correlation between accelerated trial timelines and unreported complications. Nothing statistically definitive, but enough to recommend suspension pending further review. The memo had never been forwarded. Instead, it had been replied to privately. From Olivia Walker noted, "Let's hold this internally for now. Escalation would be premature." Premature. Ethan closed his eyes. This was the moment. Not the affair, not the divorce, not even the CEO announcement. This was the point of no return, the decision Olivia assumed existed only in memory, protected by hierarchy and time. She believed no one else remembered it clearly. That the people who might question it had moved on, signed NDAs, or learned to stay quiet. She did not account for Ethan. He had not worked at Helix. He had not signed anything. He had simply listened, absorbed, remembered, and archived. That night, Olivia called. Her name lit up his phone like a disturbance he had been expecting. "Ethan," she said, voice controlled, familiar in its restraint. "My lawyer says you haven't responded yet." "I've been busy," he replied. A pause. She was recalibrating. "This doesn't need to be adversarial," Olivia said. "We both know how this goes. Clean break. Privacy. Respect. Respect again." "Do we?" Ethan asked. Another pause, longer this time. "You sound different," she said carefully. "I am." She exhaled just enough to register. "If this is about Marcus, it's not." Ethan interrupted, his voice surprised even him. Calm, flat, certain. Silence stretched between them, taut as wire. "Then what is it about?" Olivia asked. Ethan looked at the open documents on his desk, at the highlighted lines and timestamps that refused to fade, no matter how often he reread them. "It's about Atlas Phase 2, he said. The silence that followed was no longer controlled. It was raw. "I don't know what you think, you remember." Olivia finally said, each word measured, "But you're not in a position to—" "I'm in the only position that matters," Ethan replied. "I'm the one who knows." Her breath caught, just barely. "You're reading things out of context," she said. "That project went through every required channel." Eventually, Ethan said, after the narrative was locked, "Ethan, I'm not calling you to threaten you," he continued. "I just want you to understand something." He stood walking to the window, the city dark behind his reflection. "You filed for divorce because you believed you were finally untouchable," he said, "that nothing from before could reach you now." Another silence. Then softly, "What do you want?" The question hung between them, heavier than any accusation. Ethan realized in that moment that this was the true secret he carried. Not just the documents, not just the evidence, but the power to decide what story would survive. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. He ended the call before she could respond. Later, alone in the house that echoed with absence, Ethan placed the most critical documents into a new folder. He encrypted it, backed it up twice, and stored a physical copy somewhere Olivia would never think to look. The secret was no longer just knowledge. It was choice. And Olivia Walker, CEO of Helix Biomedical, had built her life on the assumption that some choices disappeared with time. She was wrong. Olivia Walker had learned to recognize threat long before it spoke. It was never loud, never dramatic. Threat arrived instead as hesitation, an unexpected pause in a conversation. A delay where there should have been momentum, a look held half a second too long. By the time words appeared, the balance had already shifted. 3 days after her call with Ethan, Olivia sat alone in her corner office in Manhattan, watching the city move beneath her like a living organism she had finally mastered. The glass walls were pristine, soundproof, designed to signal transparency while ensuring control. From the outside, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Inside, something had loosened. Her calendar was full, but her focus wasn't. She reread the same email from regulatory affairs for the third time without absorbing it. The words routine inquiry hovered on the screen, benign in isolation, unsettling in context. Routine inquiries didn't happen without reason. She thought of Ethan, not with anger, not even resentment, with something closer to irritation, the kind reserved for variables that refused to behave as predicted. He had always been reliable in that way, quiet, accommodating, emotionally legible. Even his disappointment had been gentle. This version of Ethan's silent, measured withholding was unfamiliar, and therefore dangerous. "Everything okay?" Marcus asked from the doorway, leaning casually against the frame as if he belonged there. He had adopted that posture, recently present but never presumptive, a man careful not to be seen wanting too much. "Fine," Olivia said too quickly. She closed her laptop. "Why, you've been distracted," he replied, choosing the word like a consultant might, accurate but bloodless. "Board prep meeting moved up. Compliance wants additional documentation on Atlas." Olivia's jaw tightened just slightly. "That's not unusual," she said. "We've been through this before." "Yes," Marcus agreed, "but timing matters." She looked at him, then really looked. For the first time, she wondered whether he sensed the same instability she did, or whether he was simply good at recognizing opportunity. "What are you implying?" she asked. Marcus smiled faintly. "Nothing, just that narratives are fragile in transition." That word again, narrative. After he left, Olivia remained seated, hands folded neatly on the desk. She prided herself on never panicking, never reacting prematurely. But her mind kept returning to Ethan's voice, calm, unthreatening, entirely devoid of the defensiveness she had prepared for. "I'm not calling you to threaten you." That was the problem. Threats could be managed, negotiated, neutralized. Silence could not. Across the river in Boston, Ethan attended meetings he barely remembered scheduling. He spoke when spoken to, nodded at the appropriate moments, filed reports on time. To anyone watching, he was coping admirably. Inside, he was learning the precise weight of restraint. He did nothing. No calls to journalists, no anonymous tips, no legal maneuvers. He didn't even respond to Olivia's lawyer's increasingly pointed emails. He let the quiet stretch, let assumptions bloom and rot on their own. And the world sensitive to imbalance began to respond. A former Helix colleague emailed him unexpectedly, asking if he was doing okay. A compliance consultant left a voicemail oddly vague, referencing past projects and shared history. The regulatory inquiry expanded, not formally, not publicly, but enough to ripple through executive circles. Olivia noticed. She noticed when a board member stopped making eye contact during a meeting. When legal requested documentation she had already approved months earlier. When an investor asked carefully whether Helix had contingency exposure related to legacy trials. Legacy. The past suddenly unburied. That night, Olivia stood alone in her apartment, overlooking Central Park City lights fracturing against the glass. She poured herself a drink she didn't want and stared at her phone, willing it to remain silent. It didn't. From Ethan, I'm not planning to say anything. No explanation, no context, just a sentence or thoughts. Her fingers trembled, barely perceptible. She typed, deleted, typed again. Then why are things happening? The response came minutes later. Because silence invites questions. She sank onto the couch, the truth settling into her bones with a chill she hadn't felt in years. Ethan wasn't attacking her. He wasn't defending himself. He was letting gravity do the work. For the first time since her ascent, Olivia understood what it meant to be exposed, not by scandal, not by accusation, but by the knowledge that the person who once protected her was no longer invested in preserving the illusion. Power had shifted, not loudly, not publicly, but irreversibly. And somewhere between Boston and New York, in the quiet space where control used to live, Olivia realized that becoming untouchable had always been a myth. Ethan's silence had teeth, and it was closing in. They met on a Sunday afternoon in a hotel lounge neither of them had reason to love. It was neutral ground, too anonymous for memories, too polished for comfort. The kind of place executives chose when they wanted discretion without intimacy. Floor-to-ceiling windows let in a pale winter light that softened everything it touched, as if the room itself were trying to reduce the damage. Ethan arrived first. He chose a seat near the window, back straight, hands resting loosely on his knees. He didn't check his phone. He didn't rehearse what he would say. The moment had passed for speeches. What remained was alignment between what he knew, what he felt, and what he was willing to live with. Olivia arrived exactly on time. She wore a tailored gray coat, hair pulled back with clinical precision, CEO armor. When she saw Ethan, she hesitated, not long enough to draw attention, but long enough to register the difference. He looked the same, and yet not. She sat across from him. For a few seconds, neither spoke. Outside, traffic moved steadily. Cups clinked softly behind the bar. The world continued indifferent to the small reckoning unfolding in its margins. "You said you weren't planning to say anything," Olivia began. "I'm not," Ethan replied. "Then we're done here," she said, relief edging her voice despite her effort to contain it. "No," Ethan said quietly. "We're not." She studied him now, searching for cracks. "You wanted this meeting," she said. "So say what you came to say." Ethan nodded. "I wanted to see if you understood." "Understood what? That I never needed to raise my voice," he said. "Because you already know." Her jaw tightened. "This is about Atlas," she said. "Not a question." "Yes." Olivia exhaled slowly, folding her hands together. "You're taking fragments and giving them weight they don't deserve." Every decision was vetted. Legal approved. After the narrative was shaped, Ethan interrupted. His tone didn't change. That was the most unsettling part. "You optimized uncertainty," he continued. "You didn't fabricate data. You curated it. That's worse." Her eyes flickered just once. "You don't understand how these systems work," she said. "You never did." "I understand responsibility," Ethan replied. "I understand choosing momentum over caution and calling it leadership." She leaned back, defensive now. "You're moralizing. That's easy, when you're not accountable for outcomes." "I was accountable," he said, "just not publicly." The words landed between them, heavier than accusation. Olivia's gaze sharpened. "What does that mean?" Ethan reached into his coat and placed a slim envelope on the table. He didn't slide it toward her. He simply set it down, centered, as if offering proof rather than threat. "Do you remember the compliance memo from Phase 2, he asked. Her face remained still. Too still. "The one that never escalated," he continued. "The one you said was premature." "I remember," she said. "There's an addendum," Ethan said, written 2 weeks later. It linked the accelerated protocol to adverse events that were never publicly disclosed. The analysts flagged it for immediate suspension. "That memo was speculative," Olivia said quickly. "It was buried," Ethan replied. "That was your decision." She stared at the envelope as if it might detonate. "You don't have standing," she said finally. "You weren't an employee. You weren't part of the process." "No," Ethan agreed. "I was the person you came home to, the one you trusted enough to say you were afraid." Her breath caught. "That addendum never left legal," she said. "It was destroyed." Ethan shook his head. You forwarded it to your personal email. You were exhausted. You wanted to read it later. Later never came. I archived it, he said, along with the metadata. Silence filled the space between them, dense and unmistakable. Olivia closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, something fundamental had shifted. The confidence was still there, but it was no longer absolute. What do you want? She asked again, softer this time. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He thought of the nights he'd waited up, the years he'd compressed himself to make room for her ascent, the moment she filed for divorce without looking back. I want you to understand, he said at last, that I could end this. She nodded, no denial now, but I won't, he continued. Not because you deserve protection, but because I refuse to become someone who confuses destruction with justice. Her eyes filled, not with tears, but with something closer to recognition. And the divorce, she asked, that's still happening, Ethan said. This doesn't buy reconciliation. I didn't expect it to. They sat there, two people bound by a history neither could undo, facing the cost of choices made too early and truths spoken too late. As they stood to leave, Olivia paused. You could have ruined me, she said. Ethan met her gaze. I know. That was the secret that changed everything. Not the documents, not the evidence, but the fact that Ethan Walker no longer needed power to prove he had it. And Olivia knew it. The days after the meeting passed without drama, which made them unbearable. Ethan woke each morning with the same quiet weight in his chest, not panic, not grief, but the persistent pressure of an unanswered question. The city moved as it always had. Coffee shops open, meetings filled calendars. Life insisted on continuity, indifferent to the moral crossroads he stood on. The envelope remained locked in his desk drawer. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. The contents had already rearranged the architecture of his thinking. What haunted him now wasn't whether he could expose Olivia, but what doing so would make of him. At work, Ethan found himself staring at blueprints longer than necessary, tracing lines that were never meant to bear weight. He thought of system, show they failed not from collapse, but from overload. Too much pressure applied too quietly for too long. That was how people broke too. His sister called one evening, her voice careful. You don't sound angry, she said. That worries me. I'm not angry, Ethan replied. What are you then? He considered the question longer than she expected. Deciding. That night, he received an email from a journalist at a major medical publication. The message was polite, vague, professionally curious. We're reviewing legacy clinical trials in the biotech sector. Your name surfaced as someone who may have insight into Helix Biomedical's early phase 2 decisions. Any comment would be off the record. Ethan stared at the screen until the words blurred. This was how it happened, not with explosions or public accusations, but with doors quietly opening, waiting for someone to step through. He didn't reply. Instead, he went for a walk. The river was dark, the air sharp with winter. He walked without destination, hands buried in his coat pockets, replaying memories that no longer asked permission to surface. Olivia asleep on his shoulder during red-eye flights. Olivia crying in their kitchen, whispering that she was afraid of being irrelevant. Olivia filing for divorce with surgical calm. He realized then that exposing her wouldn't give him closure. It would give him authorship. He would become the man who ended her career, and she would become the woman who deserved it. The simplicity of that narrative was tempting. Back home, Ethan opened the drawer and took out the envelope for the first time since the hotel. He laid the documents across his desk, methodical, unemotional. He imagined the headlines, the investigations, the public reckoning. He imagined Olivia's face not triumphant, not defiant, but hollowed by a fall she'd never believed possible. And then he imagined himself afterward. Not vindicated, just empty. His phone buzzed. From Olivia, compliance is escalating. I don't know how far this goes. I won't ask you to protect me, but I need to know if you're going to destroy me. The word destroy lingered. Ethan typed, paused, erased. Typed again. I'm not your shield anymore, he wrote. Then added, but I'm not your executioner either. He sealed the envelope again. The next morning, Ethan forwarded a single email to his lawyer, not a journalist. It contained one sentence. I want this divorce finalized without delay. No additional claims. By the end of the week, the inquiry stalled. Not resolved, not erased, just suspended. Momentum dissipated without a narrative to sustain it. Systems deprived of pressure returned to equilibrium. Olivia kept her title. She lost something else. Ethan felt it when he signed the final papers, an unexpected lightness, like setting down a weight he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it wasn't part of him. He walked out of the office alone, breathing deeply, unremarkable to anyone watching. He had chosen not to speak, not out of mercy, out of self-respect. The choice didn't make him noble, it made him free. And for the first time since Olivia's ascent, Ethan Walker understood that dignity wasn't what you defended, it was what you refused to trade, even when the price was tempting. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday morning, the kind that arrived without ceremony. Rain traced thin, uneven lines down the windows of the courthouse, blurring the city into something abstract and distant. Ethan signed in where indicated thank no one, and left before the ink had time to dry. There were no reporters, no lingering stares, just the quiet efficiency of a system built to dissolve lives without acknowledging what they once meant. Outside, he stood for a moment, letting the rain soak into his coat. It felt appropriate. Across the river in a glass tower that still bore her name on the executive directory, Olivia Walker chaired her first full board meeting since the inquiry had gone dormant. The room was polished, controlled, and respectful. Applause followed her remarks. The numbers were strong. The future on paper remained intact. Yet something in the room had shifted. She noticed it in the way conversations ended sooner, in the careful neutrality of colleagues who once sought her approval with warmth. No one accused her of anything. No one needed to. The myth of invincibility had cracked, and everyone could feel the draft. Power, she realized, was not something you lost all at once. It leaked. After the meeting, Olivia returned to her office and closed the door. She sat in silence, staring at the city she had once believed she could outpace. Her phone buzzed with congratulatory messages, investors, partners, strangers, impressed by resilience. One message never came. She opened her desk drawer and found an old photograph she had forgotten to discard. Ethan and her younger standing in front of a half-finished building he had designed. She remembered how he had talked about load-bearing walls, about how unseen structures carried everything above them. She understood now what she had dismantled. Not a marriage, a witness. Ethan spent that afternoon packing the study. He moved slowly, deliberately, deciding what to keep and what to let go. The folder, the one that had changed everything, went into the shredder page by page. The sound was final, almost soothing. He felt no triumph, no regret, only release. That evening, he walked through the empty house one last time. The echo no longer frightened him. He turned off lights, closed doors, left the keys on the counter. When he stepped outside, the air felt lighter, as if the space he'd been occupying had finally let him go. Weeks later, Ethan stood on the balcony of a small apartment overlooking a quieter stretch of the river. No glass towers, no reflections demanding interpretation. He had taken a new position, not a promotion, not a retreat. Just work that required his presence and rewarded his honesty. Sometimes late at night, he thought of Olivia, not with longing, with clarity. She had kept her title, but she had lost the certainty that once fueled her ascent, the belief that ambition justified everything, that silence was ownership, that some people existed only to absorb consequences on her behalf. She would never get that back. Ethan gained nothing anyone could measure. No money, no recognition, no public vindication. What he gained was quieter. Mornings without dread, evenings without vigilance. A life no longer shaped around protecting someone else's shadow. One night, as the city settled into its hum, Ethan poured himself a drink and stood by the window. His phone buzzed a message from an unknown number. "I hope you're well." He didn't reply, not out of bitterness, but because peace, he had learned, did not require acknowledgement. It only required space. Ethan turned off the light, letting the room fall into darkness behind him, and watched the river move steadily forward, unconcerned with what had been lost, carrying only what could float. And for the first time in a long time, so did he.